I recently came around to finally playing Metro Exodus, the most recent entry in the Metro series of games, which has been on my definitely going to play one day when I have time list for quite a while now. So I can now talk about it. It's just because I want to, and it's pretty much as simple as that. You know, I'm really getting a grip of these intro things. Unlike the linearity of the previous games, Metro Exodus have a relatively open survival FPS structure. The gameplay leans towards the more realistic or grounded side, and its narrative is based on a loose adaptation of the Russian novels written by Dmitry Glukhovsky. Just like those other Metro games, who would have thought, right? Anyways, there are certainly a number of differences between this game and the previous titles, some of which I will of course get into below. No, wait, that only makes sense for me. You don't have a script. Further on, I mean, except starting now. Next section. So let's start off with an area where we see some of the most divergence from the previous titles, which is in the levels. In contrast to the strictly linear levels of the previous games, we primarily have an open level structure here. It varies somewhat depending on the map, and some levels adhere more to the linear structure of the previous titles, but it has sufficient freedom overall to classify it as following open level design practices, at least on aggregate. Most games that do have open levels do have certain sections that are less open and more linear, obviously. The proportion which leans one way or the other, meaning open level versus linear, can vary somewhat between games, but I would certainly say that if about 50% of the game has an open level structure as opposed to a linear structure, that's more than enough to classify it as following open level design practices, at least in aggregate or in general. Okay, with that little elaboration out of the way, let's continue. Game genre categorization isn't really a strict science in the first place. The categories themselves are often very loose and prone to interpretation. I am of course obnoxiously eager to always go on side tangents related to game design, media critique and other loosely related topics. But since it turns out that this would have taken much more time than I had initially anticipated when writing it, I decided to split it into a separate video. Since while I am entirely fine with having side tangents, I try not to have side essays in the middle of another subject, unless they are irrevocably interconnected. So here, I'll just sum it up in a more concise manner. As mentioned, a number of the areas have a reasonably large degree of freedom in where you go and allow for a decent amount of environmental exploration and discovery. Others are more linear levels, more akin to what you would find in the previous Metro games, with little to no environmental exploration and discovery. And most areas are designed to allow for choice of approach, however. You are limited in how to progress, and you travel from area to area linearly. You're also unable to backtrack to previous locations when you've moved on to the next one. Oh yeah, also, no fast travel! Forgot to mention that. Don't forget your car! The amount of side objectives is somewhat limited, but there are a few. And there's also a number of voluntary completion criteria for some missions. Mainly non-lethal versus lethal approach, with the non-lethal option obligating stealth. This doesn't increase the amount of content, of course, but could improve replayability. So that's a little bit of a bonus worth considering, I suppose. Please keep in mind that something like finding a hidden stash would not classify as environmental exploration or discovery. That's just hidden resources. All Metro games have had hidden resources. Only Exodus has environmental exploration, meaning areas of decent size which are non-obligatory to explore. And this was a fun thing, apparently there's no consensus on whether or not enemies respawn in this game. And when you check online, you're gonna find claims directly contradicting each other. Of course, nobody actually has checked, they just go by what they inferred from their own playthrough. And as such, I suppose it's about time to just do some research for myself, because apparently nobody else has been bothered to. But they're certainly happy to make a bunch of claims on the internet, because that's, well, I guess that's just how it's done nowadays. Actually gonna verify what you claim on the internet? Nah, who would ever do that? Well, I will. So let's start with the claim that bandits respawn in their camps after you've slept. This is bollocks. I verified this by sleeping in 2 different beds for multiple days and at various distances away from the cleared camp in case that was a factor. It wasn't. They didn't respawn. This claim is bullshit. Great. Okay. Enemy creatures, on the other hand, yes, they very much do respawn. Absolutely. So let's actually talk about what seems to be the case instead. Which is that enemy camps can be repopulated at certain checkpoints in the story. So there's certain story triggers that repopulate the camps and respawn the enemies. They do, however, not respawn just because you sleep, or because you have waited for 2 days, or because you have walked a certain arbitrary distance from the camp. That's bollocks. So in summary, enemy bandits mostly do not respawn except for certain story triggers, and enemy wildlife or hostile wildlife do respawn consistently, and their amount and activity is based on whether it's night or day. This is of course based on in-game testing, so do take it with a grain of salt. I am not going to break out the source code here. I am not doing that at this point. I do know Metro Exodus does have an editor. It is possible you might be able to check there whether enemies naturally respawn or not. But I'm just not going to install and search through their entire editor right now to see if that's the case, I'm afraid. So yeah, sorry about that. But it's not happening. I'm done with this. So I would just have a very simple request for the people who make these kind of claims. Please stop making factual claims about things you do not know anything about and you don't have the drive to do the most fundamental verification possible for. Especially when it's in response to someone asking a direct question. Thanks. So back to topic, resources and collectibles also do not respawn. Collectibles in this case primarily consisting of written documents. At least that seems to be the case, but this is not something I've taken time to test and verify. Just as a heads up. And what you have missed or haven't done when moving on to the next area will of course remain unresolved. Well, until the next playthrough, but anyways, moving on. That's a summary of the overall game structure and fundamental mechanics. Now this has a number of implications, in general as well as compared to the previous titles. Firstly, loot not respawning and enemy bandits seemingly only respawning at certain set points allows for a more strictly imposed loot scarcity. This is obviously very deliberate since it's a core feature of the Metro games, and is basically essential for the experience it intends to deliver. Since the extent to which you explore and scavenge is optional, the maximum resource potential is likely greater than what you'll be able to achieve in the previous titles. Conversely, however, if you decide to focus solely on the main missions, you'll likely end up with comparatively less resources. This is rather necessary for open-level games, however, since the game should be reasonably manageable even if you choose not to extensively explore the surrounding areas or complete side missions. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be optional, which somewhat defeats the point. The satisfaction of finding things tends to be partially derived from the fact that it isn't required, meaning you found something everyone else doesn't, and that you could have missed it. If everything would have been required, it would almost have more of a collectathon structure. It wouldn't be impossible to design a survival RPG or FPS game in this manner, of course, but it would be highly unusual. Since this is an open level game as opposed to an open world game, there's no real need for enemy difficulty scaling, where enemies or enemy forces all over get stronger to keep the game engaging and at least somewhat challenging. Open levels generally allows for a more deliberately structured loot and enemy progression tailored for the location you are currently at, without having to accommodate for potentially unforeseen circumstances, such as excessively powerful and over-equipped players. Basically, you'll have a better grasp of what the player could have acquired at each stage of the game. This is in contrast to many open world games, where the player can take on a huge range of quests at any given point in the game. Meaning that if the difficulty is completely consistent, independent of the player's progression, all quests which could have been taken on early would be extremely trivial later on. It is not ubiquitous in open world games, but rather common. It can be and has been managed differently in games presently and previously as well. It also isn't non-existent in non-open world games, but it's not quite as common. I don't intend to get further into that subject at this point, however, I can save that for some other time. They also made away with currency and stores this time around, replacing it with a crafting system. I don't think this is better or worse really, but it's more appropriate and coherent in respect to the story and narrative. In the other games, where you were primarily traveling alone between settlements, the currency system didn't feel particularly out of place. But since it wouldn't really make sense in the current setting, I'd say this is a pretty clever way to thematically adapt the resource system. I did find the idea of currency having a dual purpose as higher damage ammunition in the previous games to be pretty cool, even if I seldom found it worthwhile to use it for that purpose. And if they make additional Metro games, I do hope they don't abandon this concept entirely. I don't see why the systems couldn't coexist concurrently if thematically cohesive. Just as in the previous games, you also have modifications and attachments for each gun. There's a little bit more variety this time around as opposed to previously, when perhaps you could have a silencer or a sight added. This time around there's like 3-4 different barrels perhaps, so that gives you a little bit more variety and customization there, which is kind of nice. And there's also a kind of durability or degradation system this time around. Now, I've never been a big fan of systems like this in general in games. I usually find them mostly bothersome, and it feels more like busy work to try to maintain your gun all the time. But it's not especially intrusive either, so it doesn't really affect me much one way or the other. It doesn't bother me that it's there, but I wouldn't miss it if it wasn't. There seems to be a bit of an issue with what seems to be a visual bug in the weapon degradation system though, with the weapons sometimes appearing to be in very poor condition, but not actually being so. Now, it seems just quickly toggling the repair or clean button in a workbench will reset the visual status to the appropriate level, and this has only happened a couple of times. At the same time though, if this is indeed a problem and it wasn't just me being mistaken, it is a little bit annoying since the only way for you to tell the status of your gun when you are out in the field is the visual appearance of it. It also appears that if you switch weapon parts on a weapon, this will change the weapon status. This would make sense logically, since each part would realistically be worn out independently. I actually did some testing after I noticed that this happened, and yes, each part does indeed seem to have its independent status. Well, either that or something else weird is happening. But assuming they do have separate status and durability, I don't have a problem with this. That's actually kinda cool. It's just very odd that they wouldn't say that anywhere. And from what is written in the game, the inference would be that the whole weapon has a durability, not each part. So quite frankly, I just don't know what the heck is going on. I don't know if changing the parts just decreases and increases the overall durability of the whole weapon, like the amount of durability it can have, and thereby a small amount of durability looks like more durability because the full gauge is like 1000 as opposed to 800, or if it's something else. I mean, this is something you should explain. You can't just leave this up to kind of player inference or whatever. I mean, that's just not really sensible. So yeah, that's not ideal, but anyways. The combat in Exodus strikes a pretty decent balance between pseudo-realism and its more implausible and exaggerated elements. The weapons have a decent recoil, and the damage done on Ranger difficulty, which is the one I played on, is intense. I did start another playthrough on just normal hardcore and not ranger difficulty to have a little bit of a comparison between the two. And you still obviously do a lot of damage, but you can of course take more damage on the lower difficulties. This will make the game slightly less realistic and intense, I suppose. It will of course also depend somewhat on your own experience level and skill. Either way, at the end of the day, this is just a natural result of having a difficulty selection. If that isn't acceptable to you, you just have to forgo having one, which of course will limit the amount of people that can play your game as well, which isn't ideal either, but there you go. Such is the trade-off. But it is, as mentioned, pseudo-realistic combat. We also have the often present scientifically miraculous heal syringes you often find in FPS games as well. Basically, adherence to realism obviously isn't the foremost priority here, as you should have expected. If you want that, I'd recommend something in the vein of Arma. Nevertheless, you will die and kill fast, and a couple of bullets is often fatal, depending on where they hit. This holds true for you and your enemies. You are certainly no action hero and should plan your approach accordingly. I would also suggest that the higher difficulty tend to encourage the use of stealth. And speaking of which, let's just quickly cover stealth a bit here. It is rather similar to how it has worked in the previous games. The enemies are reasonably competent, but no geniuses. Both sound and light are important factors to staying hidden, and the absolute majority of light sources can be extinguished. It still isn't a dedicated stealth game though, and mechanics like dragging and hiding bodies isn't really a thing. So the enemies will be staying where you took them out, whether lethally or not. And on that subject, I'll also note here that melee stealth takedown is the only way to do a non-lethal takedown in this game. Meaning that if you want to avoid killing people, you'll be sneaking. The stealth path in this game, meaning the one or several ways the designers foresee or intend a player to make their way through the level unseen, it sometimes, but not always, comes off as rather artificially constructed. Especially in the main missions where stealth might be a requirement to not kill non-evil hostiles. This generally isn't the feeling you want to invoke as far as I'm concerned. Now, it varies in how intense this notion is. Sometimes it's better, other times it really just feels like you're following the yellow line. There's also a day and night cycle going on in the open areas of the game, which is worth keeping an eye on, since this will substantially affect your prospects in regard to stealth, since you're obviously much harder to see in the dark of night. In the non-open areas, you are usually below ground in tunnels, so it's pretty dark either way. At least for the most part. If it isn't dark and you can't sneak, that's just because the game designers didn't want you to do that in that specific area. There are a few areas like this, a few arenas and pseudo-boss fights, I suppose. Again, it's an FPS game with stealth mechanics, it's not a stealth game. I don't expect to be able to sneak through every single challenge in the game. That's fine. Just one quick little additional note associated to stealth. Yes, I do find using night vision is slightly obnoxious. Everything remotely bright becomes amplified to the point of being borderline blinding. The difference between how it looks and how easy it is to see in the previous game being Last Light is rather stark. Now, I'm pretty sure this is intentional, in order to limit its effectiveness and discourage people from keeping it on in perpetuity, in the way that you usually do in games such as Splinter Cell. To be honest, I'm for the most part not a huge fan of night vision in games either way. It kind of negates all texture work when you run everything through a rather crude green filter, honestly. And it really doesn't look especially visually appealing or interesting either, especially not for long periods of time. But there you go. I think it's worth noting either way. Something else that's kind of interesting is that during night the creatures are wandering about much more, which obviously makes it harder and more dangerous to wander about, since they are going to try to kill you if they see you. On the other hand, it's going to be easier to take down humans because they have a much harder time seeing you, so it's a bit of a trade-off in that sense. There's an interesting balance there, which is kind of cool. It's also obviously immersive and just neat. There are quite a few of these cool little details that you find as you play through the game as well. There are of course the more common things, such as just overhearing bandits talking about their plans and what they're gonna do next and so on and so forth. But there's also a few things that's a little bit more uncommon. For example, that quite a few of the events just play out in-game. Not major story developments and plot point reveals and so on and so forth, obviously. But minor events that's just kind of there to add some flavor and tension, sure. It feels a little bit more rewarding because it's something that you actually noticed yourself because you paid attention, as opposed to something that was really forcefully fed to you. For example, your squad is fighting off a demon when you return to the train, but that's not something that they really show you. You can easily miss it if you don't look at it. Another example of a little detail is that it's not unusual that when you fight off a camp of bandits, the last one will surrender. Which sort of makes sense, considering when you've killed like 6 of his team, it's pretty likely he doesn't have much of a chance anyways. Probably rather dispiriting if nothing else. I really like these small little details that help build up the world and make it feel more authentic and alive. This obviously isn't the only game that has these kind of things, but I appreciate it every time I see it. Anyways, back to topic. I suppose the last thing that's probably worth mentioning here is that we still have the gas mask and filter system that's sort of iconic for the Metro games. While immersive, it is fundamentally very mechanically simple. You basically just have a timer and you change a filter when the timer runs out and you have a certain amount of filters. It's basically as simple as that. It works essentially the same as it has done in the previous games. A small difference is that in the previous games you usually tend to find a new gas mask when your previous one broke, while in this game you actually can repair your current one. And thanks to the crafting system you can obviously craft filters as well. Either way, altogether very similar, not much of a difference from the previous games. I still like it and it's effectively immersive, but other than that there isn't much to elaborate on really. Still there, still works. Still pretty much the same. If it ain't broke, why fix it, right? All around, this game provides a decent challenge and a solid combat experience. I think it's pretty well balanced for the most part. It's also worth noting that stealth is sometimes required for what's considered the morally correct choice, which will give you the more positive outcome story-wise. Which might be perceived as somewhat annoying to the people who prefer the other playstyles, but still desire the more positive ending. Either way, the game delivers what it aims for quite well. Relatively grounded, high lethality FPS combat with a multi-approach design and impactful weapons that feels appropriately deadly. The story and narrative is pretty solid overall, and delivers a simple and pretty grounded plot with a functional and simple main objective for the story, while veering away from the more supernatural and extravagant plot of the previous entries. There are a few supernatural oddities, and there is a few references and mentions of the Dark Ones, since this is a continuation of the Metro story, but it's far from being a substantial part of the game. You're not fighting strange, unknown psychic beings, and you are not saving a whole metro from annihilation.
Artyom, I understand how you feel, but you're not always going to save the metro single-handedly.
This is instead compensated for by having a rather strong ensemble of characters that are relatively developed and complex when compared to what we often see in games on average. And as usual for Metro games, the atmosphere does an excellent job in capturing a melancholy and sober depiction of the horrors of a post-nuclear world. Albeit, to be fair, it also has its moments of beauty, if perhaps with a slightly sad and solitary tinge to it. Is it a realistic depiction? No, not really. But it very successfully captures the appropriate mood, tone and atmosphere of a world in decay. The essence of what you'd expect such a world to feel like, but not what it would actually be. It is, as mentioned before, based on a written literary work by Dmitry Glukhovsky, an adaptation, of course, not a direct translation. It continues the story of Artyom after the events of Last Light, but has largely left the story arc of the Dark Ones behind, which is now a diminishingly small part of the story. Likewise, the story surrounding the communist Hansa and the fascist anti-mutation supremacists, which certainly was a central part of the narrative in the first game, is now largely absent. Which is a very natural progression of the story as you're leaving the metro along with its conflicts and factions behind. Really the society you've come to know as a whole. Venturing out beyond the walls of the metro, exploring the bombed out wasteland left behind after the war. This time around, the story centers around government corruption and the immoral and desperate measures humans take in order to survive. The focus is more on character dynamics and relations rather than an extravagant plot, something I find to be primarily to its benefit, since it does so quite well. It isn't bereft of a central narrative, of course, and there is a certain intrigue in finding out what you will discover in the bombed-out wasteland the world has become. But the discovery of the world is honestly more interesting than the goal in this case. It is appropriately dark for a dystopian survival game, and depending on what playstyle you choose, it can be anywhere from somewhat bittersweet to outright dispiriting. It will depend on how you play. Being merciful, using stealth, and killing as few people as possible will generally grant you the happier, more idealistic results. Meanwhile, killing people who could be considered to be morally ambiguous targets, such as brainwashed followers and slaves, leads to more death and despair, not just for the enemy but for your team as well. The non-violent approach gives a perhaps statistically unrealistic positive ending, while the more violent approach delivers story results that I believe might be more probable from the world that Metro exists in. If somewhat more depressing, which is exactly what I would expect. This is not to say that the positive ending is impossible, but if I were to estimate the most likely results, considering the hostile hellhole of a world this story takes place in, I'd say the negative ending is a more likely outcome. It is like the probability of surviving a suicide mission. With an estimate survival chance of about 10%, it isn't impossible, but I wouldn't bank on it. It is improbable, but stranger things has happened. The story is as usual delivered through cutscenes to some degree, in the same way that all previous Metro games has done it, but it also has quite a bit of in-game miscellaneous dialogue. It's not necessarily the absolute magnitude of dialogue that stood out, even though it certainly has a fair amount, but rather how it was delivered, which is primarily as a casual conversation in tone. This delivery style is present both in-game and in the cutscenes, but most dialogue is implemented as in-game conversations that you can walk away from at any time. So let's see if I can't explain and elaborate a little bit on this with some kind of semblance of coherency. But just as a quick little qualification first, I don't talk in absolutes, because funnily enough I'm not Sith, as surprising as that might be. I'm talking in general terms about what is more or less common, not necessarily that it doesn't exist. I will of course provide some reference for what I'm talking about throughout, and hopefully be able to adequately communicate what I mean. Additionally, and hopefully not too unsurprisingly, all comparative references are based on games I have personally experienced and or am familiar with. Got all that? Great. Let's continue. In the case of Metro Exodus, the objectives you have are deliberately vague, rather simple, and center around a general lack in and availability of information.
But still, so many questions.
As a result, straightforward and explicit lore exposition is quite uncommon. The main plot essentially boils down to find out what's going on and or find a location that's hopefully safe. Therefore, providing too much information about the circumstances of the world and plot would be antithetical to the atmosphere it aims to deliver. The overall atmosphere of Metro is one of information unavailability. The whole world is nuked, and the majority of information channels and documentation has quite literally been incinerated, and what remains describe a world radically different from the one that you are in. What you learn throughout the game is primarily from self-observation that you scribble down as notes in your journal. or potentially some observation or theory your squadmate makes while you're out and about. But this is hardly any resemblance of an authoritative source. This means that the amount of story explanation and elaboration is somewhat limited. In the context of this world, there just isn't much information to further elaborate on the story with. Therefore, most exposition focuses primarily on character building and reflection about past or current events, and how they feel and perceive it. Relationship drama, personal stories, generic banter, that kind of thing. Often rather bereft of important information. It's unlikely to improve your understanding of the story too much. But the primary goal with much of the dialogue in this case also seems to be building immersion and atmosphere, building your relationship with the team, and trying to create a more intimate connection to them by giving them personality, backstory, and having them reflect on prior events and what you do. This is of course also to give validation to what you do and how you do it. But the emphasis on this kind of dialogue is unusually strong. Now, when you have dialogue that significantly adds to the player's understanding of the events taking place, you usually want to make it as easy as possible for the player to partake in it, so that as little as possible is missed or skipped. For example, audio logs or transmissions that you can listen to from anywhere while playing. You can completely validly and functionally play this game while skipping like 80% of the dialogue, and only listen to who you like or find interesting. In fact, I didn't listen to every single person in my first playthrough, because that wasn't something I wanted to do, so I didn't. And now having gone back and listened to what that person would have said, well, I really didn't miss too much, except for what that specific person thought about the things that was occurring. Kind of how you can ignore text logs or optional dialogue in RPG games with basically no major consequence. Anyways, as a result of this, there is no real issue in just cutting off the conversation if you wander a bit too far away, and it will. The audio recordings you can find in the game follow this same principle as well. They are stationary, and if you move a bit too far away, you will no longer hear it. There is no picking up or saving recordings in this game. This is, as mentioned, not going to be a functional problem though, since they only serve to flesh out the world and never hold any important or mission-critical information. So basically how it works in Exodus is that you will have to actively stand in a close vicinity to the speaker or radio to hear what is said. This obviously isn't conducive to delivering story to the player. You'd want that to be as frictionless as possible. But again, this isn't really important story, this is about having immersive dialogue. And it does make complete sense in regards to realism. If there is something legitimately important or relevant to your mission, they'll use the intercom. Because of course they will. It's sort of how anybody would act in real life. If you're interested in what's being said, you'd probably just hang around, right?
I'm sorry.
And if not, that's fine. I'd never expect you to hang around to hear every single conversation that's ever had either. I mean, you have your own life. All of these conversations are, as mentioned, non-interactive. But the player is also mute, so the player character won't reply or respond to anything at all, in fact. So it's all voice acted, almost entirely non-engageable, and functionally unimportant. The only way for you to really influence a conversation, and the only spontaneous action a character would react to, is you holstering your weapon, which sometimes positively influences the disposition of neutral characters.
He doesn't turn his satanic light on us. His gun is holstered.
That's pretty much it. Well, that and potentially shooting them, I suppose, but hopefully that'd go without saying. Now, the silent protagonist archetype isn't highly unusual in games, but the dialogue in this case is often intimate face-to-face or group conversations. And in this setting, it is somewhat unusual, since in most games with silent protagonists, the dialogue is delivered either through one-way communications or in a manner that's rather expository, either driving the plot forward or narrating to you in a way that doesn't require much of a response. BioShock and Borderlands are good examples of this.
I'll explain when you get out there.
Half-Life 2 is probably one of the games that lie closest in regards to dialogue delivery and style. But the dialogue there is still often more light-hearted.
Man, a few words, aren't you?
In fact, the world and narrative as a whole is a little bit more light-hearted and fantastical in nature.
The worst you might do is attempt to couple with your head fruitlessly.
And please keep in mind that light-hearted is not the same as happy or nice. I mean, Earth has been subjugated to an alien dictatorship, so yeah. The dialogues in Metro Exodus are often long, genuine, sincere, and sometimes intimate.
I'll be fine anywhere.
And they are, as mentioned, often very much constructed as just casual conversations. I also think each consecutive conversation might often be longer here when compared to other equivalent games, but I haven't been counting time or words here, so please don't hold me to that, thanks. Basically, the really short, no explanation TLDR here is that this game has a lot more character-driven elements when compared to most other games, especially in similar genres, such as FPS, action and survival. I'd also like to note that the dialogue is somewhat grammatically distinct, in that certain expressions and word choices may come off as somewhat unique or odd.
We were none the wiser. How perfect of them!
Sometimes this kind of weird grammar is obviously intentionally used in order to emphasize the foreign characteristics of, well, characters. And I do believe this is the case in this instance, since the American character in the game does not have this kind of weird verbiage from what I can tell. But other times it can of course just be weird translations. And they all have a Russian accent, of course, considering they live in Russia. They also have a tendency to sometimes speak over each other when in groups, which, again, is rather unusual. It's certainly more realistic in a sense. People butting in and cutting others off obviously happens frequently in real life, and people don't speak in a sequential and structured speaking order in reality. But since this can disrupt, hinder and complicate the engagement and understanding for the audience, this often isn't done in games. Overall, I'm not entirely convinced of how conversation is handled and implemented here, one way or the other. It certainly feels odd sometimes, and it feels unconventional. But then the idea that you can just hang around and listen to what feels like a natural everyday conversation does add a certain authentic notion to the game. At the same time though, the inability to respond in highly personal dialogues comes off as quite weird and unnatural.
Communication center should have them. I think it's at that lighthouse, so you should head there.
There are even a number of points in the game where they point out of the fact that you don't respond to anything. But since it isn't delivered in a particularly funny way or funny situation, and not done in a juvenile demeanor, it just comes off as rather odd.
Do as that young man does. He woke up long ago, but quietly listens to wise people talk.
I mean, you almost start to wonder if you actually legitimately mute. Not just as a design choice, but in the context of the story itself. That you cannot speak. I don't know, maybe your voice cords got burnt away by radiation or something. What do I know? But at the same time, in that case, I'm kinda surprised how all my friends can understand me without any kind of sign language or non-verbal communication in that case.
Opened fire right away, didn't they? Of course, those...
It's also worth pointing out that Artyom certainly is not a mute in the book, which this is of course based on.
And do you have your rat? Artyom asked cautiously.
But he has been a silent protagonist in all of the Metro games previously, of course.
Any shit. I don't want any trouble.
It's just that the communications in the previous Metro games are, as I kind of mentioned or hinted to previously, a little bit more expository in nature.
Or just shooting them. All because of the coming war. People are fleeing from Kuznetsky Most and their whole Red Line.
I think it could be interesting to mention some of the more miscellaneous notes and more technical aspects of the game as well, so let's quickly go through some of that here. The game looks good, the special effects meet a high standard of quality, as usual for Metro games. There are a few occasional oddities when it comes to collision, but it shouldn't be anything substantial enough to disrupt gameplay. Not to any significant degree anyways. The audio design is as usual quite superb as far as I'm concerned. The atmospheric soundscape is of course rather empty considering you are traversing a nuclear wasteland, but with that being said, there are still occasions where you discover some kind of life. Textures is something that usually varies quite a bit within games. That's very common. Some textures are considered more important, usually if you see them a lot, and therefore will receive much more work and attention than the ones that, well, aren't. This will inherently mean that the quality will vary somewhat, but the overall texture work certainly isn't sloppy, and the most important and often seen textures are quite impressive. One thing that I've always been fond of in Metro games is the design of the weapons, which I find to be distinctly weighty and powerful. And I have a fondness for the shotguns in particular, both in design and feel. Unfortunately, the more open areas reduce the universal proficiency of shotguns when compared to the more close-quarter tunnels of the previous games. The performance is entirely acceptable, nothing to note or to mention on that front. It runs well overall. The higher you crank the graphics, the more it'll demand, obviously. But it doesn't seem to hog a disproportionate amount of resources. Another thing, or perhaps criticism I would like to mention, is that the physics are a bit odd as well. Almost floaty. It's mostly noticeable on your jump, which has this kind of low gravity and frictionless characteristic to it. Now, this isn't the worst thing in the world, and it's not so bad or strange that you can't get used to handling it, and it doesn't really significantly disrupt gameplay, but it feels somewhat odd and out of place in a game with such a strong, prominent and successful focus on immersion and authenticity. There isn't any automatic aim-down lean in the game, which is a bit surprising, since it seems to be almost a standardized feature for cover-based or semi-realistic FPS games nowadays. Unless there's a manual lean feature, that is. But in this case, clearly there isn't, so there you go. A bit surprising, but hardly a serious issue. You can paddle around in a boat. It's not particularly fast or exciting, and not necessarily entirely safe either. But it's a good way to avoid traversing on land. Also, falling into water will fuck up your weapons. There's actually another thing I'd like to mention that admittedly isn't directly related to the game per se, which is that on the 6th of May, or 18th of June for console players, about 2 years after the game initially came out, Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition was released, with updated visuals, some added customization options and similar. This was given away for free to all owners of Metro Exodus, as well as future customers as well, of course. I want to mention this since even though I perhaps believe some of the options should have been available from the offset, primarily looking at FOV options here, nevertheless the fact is that they were in no obligation to release this kind of update in the first place. And that they give it away for free instead of bundling it with some kind of DLC or season pass is something that I very much appreciate. And I do think it's worthwhile recognizing pro-consumer practices when they actually happen. So that's a quick little kudos to the developers there. And I think this is a pretty decent time to get back to the game and wrap things up. So to summarize at this point, games are always a matter of personal taste, of course. Which is why I find numerical scales to be of very little value for anything but a very rough idea of rudimental quality. Warcraft 3, Portal 2 and DSE X are all great games, that's for sure. But they deliver a radically different experience. So if I rate all of them 8.5 out of 10, does that really tell you much about the experience they'll deliver? There are also games, I'm not going to get into that debate right now, which I don't especially enjoy due to the experience they deliver. But that's more due to what it actually aims to deliver rather than the objective quality of the product. So I probably wouldn't like it even if it very successfully delivered what was intended. So, shortly put, I was never the target audience. With that having been said, I really like Metro Exodus. Exceptional atmosphere has always been a strong point for Metro games, and it's about as present here as always. The same goes for the weapons of the game, which I've always found to have a impactful and heavy feel to them. The game does certainly encourage stealth, and taking a slow and considered approach to your targets, especially on the higher difficulties, is clearly the encouraged and preferable strategy. This isn't something that particularly bothers me, since I'm a pretty big fan of stealth games. Thief Gold, anyone? But I can certainly see how this wouldn't be to everyone's taste. If you are more into action-packed FPS combat a la Doom and Rage 2, for example. Since this is the only viable approach to get a positive ending as well, it is obviously somewhat tilted toward their stealth playstyle. Especially considering people tend to prefer the positive ending as well. There is a reason why it's often referred to as the quote-unquote good ending. Even though this isn't necessarily the case as far as I'm concerned. It's a more positive ending, not necessarily a better one. But I suppose it can also feel like a little bit of failure if everybody around you dies and the world becomes a terrible, horrible place after you finish the game, so it's understandable. When it comes to the game world, I think that open levels are a net benefit for the game, but I do wonder if some of the imposing and claustrophobic undertones haven't been lost. This is a natural trade-off to some degree. Perhaps something like an open tunnel network or more confined corridors in general could have preserved more of this feeling. But then again, that might also not have been what they desired, since the more open sky explorative freedom experience might have been what they were aiming for in this case. This certainly isn't an inherently bad direction, it's just different. At the same time though, I find the Stalker series already somewhat fills this niche for me, Fallout as well to some lesser degree. That being said, it's not like it's a problem to have another great game in this kind of style either, so, you know. Speaking of which, by the way, since we have a new title that came out there, this is why numerical scores can be so unproductive, by the way. This is neither a good or bad design choice, it just delivers a slightly different experience. This neither removes or adds a point, it just changes it from green to blue. Take away an intensity point, add a freedom point. Subtract a resource balance point, increase with an exploration point. It all just depends on what you desire. This is why I usually find descriptions more useful than some arbitrary numerical rating. Anyways, the story is probably the hardest thing to evaluate for me. I rather like the very informal and personal stories the characters often deliver. And they do feel realistically imperfect in a way. And sometimes I find it appealing to basically just sit back and listen to someone telling me a story. And the conversational tone is set in a way that supports this notion as well. It actually feels rather natural. At the same time though, sometimes it can also feel somewhat drawn out and disruptive to be forced to take a break in the middle of gameplay in order to listen to a radio tape or someone's life stories. And if you're at all interested in what they have to say, you will have to do so, since you can save conversations or recordings for later in this game. Additionally, the silent protagonist archetype feels somewhat out of place and weird in this setting. And it feels somewhat unnatural to just sit in what feels like it should be an interpersonal conversation, with one side saying absolutely nothing.
So, that metal is what they eat.
And to be the only person in a group that's always entirely mute, while other people still address you and banter between each other, feels really rather awkward. Like everyone is super understanding of the fact that you are some kind of hyper-competent alternate creature in human form that has the best intentions in mind, but never communicate or express a single opinion, emotion or verbal response ever, and that they just have to kind of interpret your intention and disposition. It's pretty odd. In the real world, even if you're just telling me a story, I would still give you some kind of feedback or input to validate that I'm even listening. I might even have a question about what you say. Who knows, right? But anyways, it certainly feels unique. And to be fair, there are things I like about it. Another reason I find it interesting is because it's more adherent to the book in a sense. The book itself, Metro, that is, the Metro series, has a very large amount of cross-character conversations. This is rather common in books. It is not unusual in any way.
Maybe they've already hit bottom. And where is it? The gunner asked. I don't know, by God, I don't know.
It is, however, most certainly less common in games. So it's a sort of interesting experiment and attempt to do a more direct translation of a book. At least when you compare to the previous Metro games, and also when you compare to most adaptations of books in general. When you adopt a book into a game, that is. I'm still not certain what I feel about it. I do think it's interesting, and since it is one of the earlier attempts, at least in a bigger game or a more mainstream game, to have this stricter adherence to the source material in regards to not changing the essence or substance of the story composition and components, it's perhaps something that would need a little bit more work before it becomes as refined as you would want it to be. I'm not quite sure, honestly. But I'm not entirely convinced. I guess I can leave it at that. I believe I managed to cover what I found to be the most interesting and distinguishing part of the game at this point though, so in trying to have some kind of respect to time, I'd sum it up as follows. The focus for Exodus has shifted somewhat relative to the previous games, where a more intense horror-adjacent atmosphere and objective-driven narrative, where your success could determine the future of everyone held up in your metro station, took more of a center stage. Instead, we have a more exploration-driven game, with a focus on character relations and the discovery of a world and the societies that has emerged in the wake of nuclear war, and where your mission only really is of importance and benefit to you and your squad. It is a very solid game overall, as far as I'm concerned, and I have decidedly enjoyed my time with it. Assuming this isn't the last game we'll see though, which I adamantly hope it won't be, I will certainly be interested in seeing where this series will be taken next. But that is then and now is now, so for now, I'll thank you for watching and maybe I'll see you next time.